Okay, so let's talk about the Septuagint. It's a big, important part of Bible history, and it's something a lot of people don't really know much about, but it should matter to anyone who cares about the Bible, and especially anyone who cares about Jesus and his first followers. Because for many of them, this was their Bible. Think about it this way. You go to a church or synagogue today, you see people reading from a Bible. Maybe it's an English Bible, or a Spanish one, or a German one, but that Bible, no matter the language, comes from older texts. For the Old Testament, it mostly comes from Hebrew texts. For the New Testament, it comes from Greek texts. Simple enough, right? But back in the time of Jesus, things were a bit more complex. The world was changing. Alexander the Great, centuries before Jesus, had spread Greek culture and language all over the place. This was called Hellenization, and it meant that a lot of Jewish people living outside of Judea, places like Egypt, Syria, Rome, they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. Their everyday language was Greek. And if you don't speak Hebrew, how do you read the scriptures? How do you hear them in the synagogue? You need a translation. And that's exactly what the Septuagint is. It's the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's often called the LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70, because of a famous story about how it came to be. The story, a legend really, comes from something called the Letter of Aristeas. It says that the Egyptian king Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, wanted a copy of the Jewish law for his famous library. So, he asked the high priest in Jerusalem to send scholars. The story goes that 72 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, came to Alexandria. They were all put in separate rooms, and in 72 days they each produced an identical translation of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. This miraculous agreement was seen as proof that the translation was divinely inspired. Now, most scholars today don't believe that exact story happened. It's a nice legend meant to give the translation authority. But the core of the story probably holds some truth. A translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek definitely happened in Alexandria, Egypt. And it was certainly done by Jewish scholars. But it was probably a more gradual process. The Torah, the Pentateuch, was likely translated first, maybe in the 3rd century BC. Then other books, like the prophets and the writings, were translated over the next 2 centuries. So it wasn't one big single event, but a collection of translations that grew over time. Why Alexandria? Well, Alexandria was a huge city, a center of learning and culture. And it had a very large, thriving Jewish community. These Jews, like many others in the diaspora, had largely adopted Greek as their language. They needed a Greek Bible for their synagogues, for their families, for their kids to learn about their heritage. They needed to simply be Jewish in a Greek-speaking world, so this Septuagint became the Bible for many Jews in the centuries leading up to Jesus. It was their link to their past, their guide for living, their source of prophecy and wisdom. It was the scriptures they read, studied, and preached from. And this is where Jesus and the apostles come in. Think about the world they lived in. Yes, in Judea, in places like Jerusalem and Galilee, Aramaic was the common spoken language. Jesus himself likely spoke Aramaic, and Hebrew was still the language of scholarship and sacred texts, especially for the priests and religious leaders. But Greek was everywhere too. It was the language of commerce, of government, of educated people. It was the common language across the Roman Empire. This Koine Greek, or Common Greek, was the language everyone understood. So, when the apostles started to spread the message of Jesus, where did they go? They went to the synagogues first, and then to the Gentiles. And in many of those synagogues, especially outside of Judea, the scriptures being read and studied were in Greek. They were reading from the Septuagint. We know this because of how the New Testament quotes the Old Testament. This is a really crucial point. If you pick up a modern English Bible, like the NIV or ESV, and you look at an Old Testament quote in the New Testament, then you look at that same passage in the Old Testament, it will usually match up pretty well. That's because modern English Bibles usually translate the Old Testament from the Hebrew Masoretic Text. But if you look at the original Greek New Testament and compare its Old Testament quotes to the Hebrew Masoretic Text, you'll find a lot of places where they don't quite match. And here's the kicker: in many of those places, the New Testament quote does match the Septuagint. This tells us something very important. The New Testament writers, the apostles, and probably Jesus himself, were very familiar with and often used the Septuagint. Let me give you an example. It's a famous one. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, when Matthew talks about Jesus' birth, he quotes Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, saying, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." The key word here is virgin. If you look at the Hebrew Masoretic text of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, it uses the word Almah, which means young woman. It can refer to a virgin, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It's a broader term. But the Septuagint, translated centuries before Matthew wrote his gospel, uses the Greek word parthenos, which very specifically means virgin. So, When Matthew quotes Isaiah, he's not just giving a loose interpretation. He's quoting a specific Greek translation that already used virgin. This shows us that the Septuagint's wording was influential. It shaped how early Christians understood and presented Old Testament prophecies. For them, it was already clear that Isaiah was talking about a virgin. Another example, Acts chapter 2, verse 27, when Peter preaches on the day of Pentecost, he quotes Psalm chapter 16, verse 10, saying, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor let your Holy One see corruption." The Hebrew of Psalm chapter 16, verse 10 uses Sheol for the realm of the dead. The Septuagint uses Hades. And in the New Testament, Hades is the word that is used. This is not a massive difference, but it shows the direct influence. Even more, in Psalm chapter 2, verse 7, which is quoted in Acts chapter 13, verse 33, the Septuagint says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." This specific phrasing, "especially today I have begotten you," is crucial for the early Christian understanding of Jesus' resurrection and divine sonship. And it aligns directly with the Septuagint. There are many, many more instances like this. Scholars have analyzed hundreds of Old Testament quotes in the New Testament, and a very large percentage of them, probably around 70 to 80%, either agree exactly with the Septuagint or show strong influence from it, even when they differ from the Hebrew Masoretic Text. This is not a small thing. It means that the New Testament authors, when they were writing about Jesus and explaining his significance, were often thinking with the Septuagint in mind. They were using its words, its phrases, its way of translating the Hebrew. So when Paul went to preach in places like Antioch or Ephesus or Rome, he went to synagogues where the people spoke Greek and read from the Septuagint. Imagine Paul, a brilliant, highly educated Pharisee who certainly knew Hebrew, but also spoke Greek fluently. When he stood up to preach, he could naturally refer to the scriptures using the Septuagint's wording. His audience understood him perfectly because they were familiar with that very translation. It was their common ground. It was the Bible that bridged the gap between Jewish tradition and the new message of Christ for a Greek-speaking world. This wasn't just for Jewish audiences either. When the apostles began preaching to Gentiles, who had no background in Judaism, but who were often familiar with Greek culture and language, the Septuagint served as a bridge for them too. It presented the stories and prophecies of the God of Israel in a language they could understand. It laid the groundwork for them to comprehend who Jesus was, fulfilling prophecies they could now read in their own language. The Septuagint was more than just a translation, it was also a collection of books. The Hebrew Bible, as it's put together today in Jewish tradition, has 24 books. These are divided into the Torah, prophets, and writings, but the Septuagint included more. It had all the books of the Hebrew Bible, but also a number of other books that are not found in the standard Jewish canon today. These books are often called the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books. Think of books like Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, and 1 and 2 Maccabees. It also included additions to books like Esther and Daniel. For instance, the story of Susanna and the Elders and Bel and the Dragon are found in the Septuagint's version of Daniel. These books were widely read and considered authoritative by many Greek-speaking Jews. And guess what? The early Christians also read and use these books. Some of them are quoted or alluded to in the New Testament. For example, the author of Hebrews seems familiar with themes from the Wisdom of Solomon. The Book of Jude makes an allusion to the Book of 1 Enoch, which was also part of this broader Greek collection of sacred writings. So, the IBL of Jesus and the Apostles in its Greek form was a richer, more expansive collection of literature than the Hebrew Bible we usually think of. This is a really important point because it explains why Catholic and Orthodox Bibles today include these deuterocanonical books, while Protestant Bibles usually don't. The Catholic and Orthodox traditions largely kept the Septuagint as their Old Testament text, which naturally meant keeping these additional books. When the Protestant Reformation happened, reformers went back to the Hebrew Bible as their source for the Old Testament, and because these books weren't in the Hebrew canon, they were generally removed from Protestant Bibles or placed in a separate section called the Apocrypha. So the Septuagint was foundational for early Christianity. It wasn't just a translation for the majority of early Christians, it was their Old Testament. It shaped their understanding of prophecy, theology, and the very identity of Jesus. But let's go back to the language itself. Koine Greek. This was not the fancy classical Greek of Plato and Aristotle. It was the common, everyday language of the marketplace, the home, the street. It was the language of ordinary people across the Eastern Mediterranean. This choice of language was crucial. It made the scriptures accessible to a massive audience. It democratized scripture, in a way. No longer were the sacred texts locked away in a language only a few scholars understood. Now, a Jewish merchant in Alexandria or a Gentile convert in Corinth could pick up a scroll and read God's word. This was a huge step in the spread of both Judaism and early Christianity. The impact of the Septuagint didn't stop with the apostles. It continued to be the primary Old Testament for the early church for centuries. When Christianity spread and translations into other languages were needed, those translations were often made from the Septuagint, not directly from the Hebrew. For example, the Old Latin versions, which were the Bibles of the early Western Church, were based on the Septuagint. Coptic, Ethiopic, and Syriac translations also often drew from the Septuagint. Even church fathers like Augustine, a giant of early Christian thought, primarily used the Septuagint. When Jerome, another hugely influential church father, set out to translate the Bible into Latin, what became the Vulgate, he initially started with the Septuagint. But then he decided to go back to the original Hebrew for the Old Testament, which was a very controversial decision at the time, where his Hebrew-based translation sometimes differed from the Septuagint-based Old Latin, causing quite a stir. This shows just how deeply embedded the Septuagint was in Christian tradition. For many, it was the authentic text. Now, things weren't always smooth for the Septuagint. As Christianity grew and started using the Septuagint to argue that Jesus was the Messiah, and to demonstrate how he fulfilled prophecies, Jewish communities started to get a bit uncomfortable with it. They felt the Christians were misinterpreting or misusing their scriptures. They also felt that some of the Septuagint's translations might have been too loose or not accurate enough to the Hebrew. So, after the rise of Christianity around the 2nd century AD, some Jewish scholars started producing new Greek translations that were much closer to the evolving Hebrew text of the time. We know about translations by Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodosia. These were efforts to provide a more literal Jewish Greek translation that could counter the Christian use of the Septuagint. This was a significant shift. For a time, the Septuagint had been a shared Bible. But as the split between Judaism and Christianity became wider, each community began to solidify its own preferred version of the scriptures. Over time, the Jewish community largely moved away from the Septuagint, preferring to work directly with the Hebrew, or with these newer, more literal Greek translations. The Hebrew Masoretic Text, which is the basis for most modern Jewish and Protestant Old Testaments, became the standard Jewish text. But this standardization process happened much later, centuries after Jesus. So, why does any of this matter today? Well, it matters a lot. First, for understanding the New Testament. If the New Testament authors were often quoting the Old Testament from the Septuagint, then knowing the Septuagint helps us understand their frame of reference. It helps us see why they chose certain words or how they interpreted a prophecy. It gives us insight into the very thought processes of the apostles and early Christians. It's like finding the exact dictionary they were using. Second, the Septuagint is a crucial tool for textual criticism. That's a fancy way of saying it helps scholars figure out what the original Hebrew text might have said. Remember, the Septuagint was translated centuries before the earliest complete Hebrew manuscripts we have today, like the Masoretic Text, which comes from around the 9th, 10th centuries AD. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, provided much older Hebrew manuscripts, some dating back to the Septuagint's time. And these scrolls sometimes agree with the Septuagint over the Masoretic Text. This means the Septuagint preserves readings from very old Hebrew manuscripts that no longer exist. It's a witness to an earlier stage of the Hebrew Bible, so it helps us piece together the history of the Hebrew text itself. Third, it helps us understand early Judaism. The Septuagint shows us what books were important to Jews in the Hellenistic period, what their priorities were, and how they understood their own faith in a Greek-speaking world. It's a window into a vibrant, diverse form of Judaism that existed before and during the time of Jesus. Fourth, it serves as a powerful reminder of the shared roots between Judaism and Christianity. For a time, the Septuagint was a text that both communities held sacred. Its story highlights how early Christianity grew out of Judaism, using its sacred text, albeit often reinterpreted in light of Jesus. It's important to understand a few nuances, too. The Septuagint isn't a single, monolithic translation. Different books were translated by different people at different times and in different styles. Some books, like the Torah, are generally considered well translated. Others are rougher. So, when we say the Septuagint, we're really talking about a collection of translations that were compiled together. And the Hebrew Bible itself wasn't entirely fixed or standardized when the Septuagint was made. There were different versions of Hebrew text circulating, and the Septuagint reflects some of these variations. It's not just a translation of a single Hebrew text, it's a reflection of the textual diversity of its time. Sometimes people think the Septuagint is only for academics or theologians, but that's not true. If you've ever wondered why a New Testament quote from the Old Testament seems a little different from your Old Testament, the Septuagint often holds the answer. It bridges that gap. It gives depth and context to familiar New Testament passages. Think about the spread of Christianity. Without the Septuagint, it would have been so much harder. Imagine Paul trying to explain Jesus to people who only spoke Greek, but he only had a Hebrew Bible. He'd have to translate everything on the fly, and there would be no common written text for people to refer to. The Septuagint provided that common text. It was the Bible that traveled. It was the Bible that was used in the synagogues where the apostles first preached. It was the Bible that allowed Gentiles to connect with the God of Israel. It really puts things in perspective when you realize that the earliest Christians, the very first people who followed Jesus, were often using this Greek Bible. It was their sacred text, the foundation for their faith, and the proof that Jesus was the Messiah. It was how they understood God's plan unfolding through history. So, the Septuagint is not just an old book. It's a living part of our history. It's a key to understanding the New Testament. It's a witness to early Judaism and early Christianity. It's a testament to how God's word traveled across cultures and languages, preparing the way for the good news of Jesus to reach everyone. And it continues to be important for anyone who wants a deeper understanding of the Bible and the origins of Christianity. It really was, for many, the Bible that Jesus and the apostles read, learned from, and preached from. It's a piece of history that continues to speak volumes.